Welcome to SETC Training's video on recording macros with Microsoft Word. Contact us today at setctraining.com for all of your training requirements. As soon as you register 2 people in any one of our courses, you automatically get guaranteed delivery dates with a live and in-class instructor, and we give you a 10% discount on the per person rate. If ever you have 5 people or more, ask about our group discounts. So, what should you do when you're getting ready to record a macro? Well, the single most important thing to do is to plan out the steps that you will complete while recording your macro and to practice those steps repeatedly so that you don't make mistakes when you're actually recording the macro. The next thing is obviously to make sure that you can access the macro features in Microsoft Word, and that means that you need access to the developer toolbar. Now, in my case, it's already visible, but if in your case it was not, you would simply go over here to the File menu, and under the File menu, you'd click on Options. And on Options, you would go over here to the option Customize Ribbon. And all the way over here on the right-hand side, in the main tabs, you'll find a check mark saying Developer, which you go off and access and select. That will make the developer toolbar visible. So if I go over here to the developer toolbar, you'll see that over here on the left, you see all the macro functionality under the code group. So let's create our first macro. In our case, we're going to create a macro that automates the creation of a quarterly reporting table, as you see on the screen. One of the primary considerations when creating document elements in a macro is that all supporting styles must exist before you start recording a macro. And that's because if you create a style while you are recording the macro, well, that style will get recreated every time you run the macro, and you will get an error because the style already exists, right? So in my case, since I am creating a standard table with a bunch of column headings and row headings and a caption, I have made sure that all of my column headings are in style cell top row default. All of my row headings are in style cell left heading. All of my data points are in cell data default. And my caption is, of course, using the style caption. So given that my styles all exist, I'm ready to go. Now, another primary consideration that you should consider is that word styles do not include the background of a table cell. To do that, you have to use actually table styles. But since we don't want to do this here, we're going to have to make sure that the recording of our macro includes setting the background color of the cells that need a differing background color. So let's do that. So first of all, of course, we make sure that we select a point in our document that corresponds to wherever we want to start a macro when we use it. In my case, it's an empty line in the normal style. Then, of course, I'm going to go about creating my table. But I'm going to create my table in such a way as to avoid using the mouse to select elements in the document. I'll explain that as I go through. So, of course, I go over here to the developer toolbar. I click on Record Macro. And I provide a good name. So, for example, create quarterly reports table, for example. Then I can choose to either create a button to run that macro or a keyboard shortcut. Now, in my case, since I'm going to use this macro a lot, I'm going to assign a keyboard shortcut to it. And I'm going to give it the keyboard shortcut Control plus Alt plus T. Now you'll see that the keyboard dialog box tells you that that shortcut's already assigned to the trademark symbol. Now since I can insert the trademark symbol by simply doing an open round bracket TM close round bracket, I'm not too concerned about overriding that keyboard shortcut assignment. Now you must click on the Assign button to actually assign that keyboard shortcut. And when you go over here and click on the Close button, remember that as soon as you close this dialog box, you fall into recording mode, which means that absolutely everything you do is going to be recorded. And as I click on the Close button, you'll see that the mouse cursor turns to an old style cassette tape. Now, despite the dated nature of this, it does communicate relatively clearly that you're currently recording a macro. But it also sort of communicates that you should avoid using the mouse for a lot of selection because it's hard for a macro to know where it is in a document as you're recording. So I'm going to use the keyboard to navigate through my table. So the first thing to do is clearly to create that table. Now that table has 5 rows and 5 columns. So I go over here to the Insert group and I go to Table and I select a 5 by 5 table, right? And I click Enter. Now I'm going to type in the labels. So in this case, it's quarter. I'm going to use the arrow right key to go Q1, arrow right to do Q2, arrow right, Q3, arrow right, Q4. Then I move over to my row headings and enter my heading cities, right? All right. Now I have to start doing some formatting, but because I already have styles created, well, what I can do is use my arrow up key, move over to my quarter, and now use the Control Shift and arrow right. And you'll know what will happen. As I keep hitting the arrow right key, it keeps selecting my cells. Now, as I already have the styling selected, I can go up here and say Cell Top Row Default, which was the style I created for this. But we have to remember about background of the cell. As I said, that's not included in styling. So I'm going to go back to the Home tab, and I'm going to select the gray background and apply it that way. I'm going to do exactly the same thing with my row headings. So I hold the Shift key down this time and use the arrow down key. As I do so, it selects each successive cell. Then I go up here and use the cell left heading style. Now, as you can see, once again, the background hasn't followed. So we're going to go over here and we're going to select the cell background so that it's the dark blue that we want. Finally, we're going to move over to the data section, right? We're going to hold the Shift key down. We're going to go arrow down, arrow down, arrow down, arrow right, arrow right, arrow right, always holding the Shift key. Then we go over here to Cell Data Default. Remembering again about the background of cells, so we're going to go over back up here and we're going to select white as the cell background. Finally, we want to add this caption to our table. So we're going to do arrow down, right? And we're now in the proper position to insert our caption. And we're going to go over to the References tab. And under the References tab, there's a button called Insert Caption. So we click on Insert Caption. We make sure that the label is table, and then maybe add a colon and a space. We click on OK. And as you can see, Microsoft Word puts it in the caption immediately. Now, it would make sense once I create this table with this macro to insert a caption immediately. So we'll leave it there so that after we run the macro, we'll be ready to insert a caption for our table. Since we're done, we go back over here to the developer toolbar and hit the stop recording button. Okay? And that ends the recording of our session. Now let's go check it, right? So if I press enter, you'll see here I am in a normal styled empty line. I'm going to hold my shortcut key, which is Control-Alt-T, and let's see what happens. Oh, isn't that pretty? So as you can see, I've successfully recorded a macro which produces my quarterly reporting table, and I can do that as many times as I want. And further, the really cool thing is that if I decide, oh, you know what, I want to change the font of anything. So for example, let's say I want to change the font of my column headings. Well, I can select any one of these cells, right? Make the change that I want. So for example, let's go over here to Home and let's change the font to, let's say, Arial, and let's change the sizing to 14. Okay, and let's assume that's what we want. Then we simply go to our Cell Top Row Default. In the Style dialog box, we right-click and we update it to match the selection. And you can see that every one of my headings follows along. And if we do this consistently throughout all of our documentation, it makes making formatting changes in our documents really, really simple. This has been SETC Training's video on creating macros with Microsoft Word. Don't forget to contact us for any of your training needs at www.setctraining.com.